Well, let's see what we got here. Hi kids. I have a book I'm going to read you this morning. Rizzo and I are out here in the park. This book is called Kashtanka, written by Anton Chekov, who's a Russian, and so all of his characters have Russian names which sound kind of funny to our ears, but I'll render them as best I can. The illustrations are by Genady Spirin. I hope you can see something about him. This is Luka Alexandrovich, who is a cabinet maker. And this is Kashtanka, his little brown dog, who's asleep on a pile of shavings in his wood shop. A young chestnut-colored dog who looked a bit like a fox ran up and down on the sidewalk. Every now and then she would stop, whimper, and raise first one frozen paw and then the other as she considered how she had gotten lost. The day had begun with her master, the cabinet maker, Luka Alexandrovich, putting on his cap, nestling some wooden thing wrapped up in a red kerchief under his arm, and shouting, "Kashtanka, let's go!" Kashtanka had crawled out from under the workbench where she slept, stretched, and run after her master. Outside, Kashtanka jumped around, rushed barking after the horse-drawn trolleys, and chased after other dogs. It's a winter day in Moscow, and this is Luka Alexandrovich. And here's Kashtanka down here running around, acting like a dog. Late in the day, as she and her master walked down an unfamiliar sidewalk, Kashtanka heard a burst of music and saw a regiment of soldiers coming down the street. She began to run round and round and howl. When the regiment was gone, she ran back to the spot where she had left her master. But alas, the cabinet maker was no longer there. Meanwhile, the street lamps had been lit. Big, fluffy snowflakes were painting everything white. The bridge, the backs of the horses, and the cabbies' hats. As the streets became whiter and whiter, it grew darker and darker. Kashtanka was overcome by despair and terror. She curled up in a doorway and began to cry. And here's Kashtanka, and this is a regiment of soldiers coming with cymbals and drums, and making all kinds of noise and getting her all excited. Suddenly, the door clicked, creaked, and hit Kashtanka in the side. She jumped up. From out of the door came a fat little man with a plump, clean-shaven face. "Why are you whimpering?" he asked, brushing the snow off her back with a finger. "You must be lost. Well then, come along with me." There's the little fat man in his tall top hat and his stick. And there's poor lost Kashtanka. An hour later, Kashtanka was in a big, well-lit room. The stranger had eaten his supper and thrown her some scraps of food. First some bread and a cheese rind, and then a piece of meat and some chicken bones. And now Kashtanka was considering whether it was better living with the stranger or with the cabinet maker. The stranger's room didn't smell of anything, while the cabinet maker's apartment was always filled with the magnificent smells of glue, varnish, and wood shavings. But living with the stranger had one advantage. He gave her a lot to eat, and he didn't stamp his feet and shout. When the new master put out the lamp and left the room, Kashtanka lay down and closed her eyes. As she fell asleep, she remembered how Luka Alexandrovich, his son, Fedyushka, would play with her on winter nights, while the cabinet maker was planning. Let me try that sentence again. As she fell asleep, She remembered how Luka Alexandrich's son Fedyushka would play with her on winter nights while the cabinet maker was planing or reading the newspaper out loud, and she felt sad. Okay. This is Kashtanka in the cabinet maker's shop with the wood shavings and the glue and the varnish. And this is his son, Fedyushka, up here with a cap. And here's the jolly old cabinet maker sitting in his chair with his slippers. It was already light when Kashtanka woke up. She stretched, sniffed all the furniture, and looked into the hall without finding anything interesting, so she pushed open the door of the adjoining room. There on the bed slept yesterday's stranger. Beyond the bed, Kashtanka saw another door. She scratched on it, opened it, and immediately became aware of a suspicious smell. Kashtanka growled and entered a small room with dirty wallpaper, and then drew back in alarm. A gray goose with wings outspread was coming at her. Doop, 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 hissing. Not far from the goose, a white cat arched his neck, swished his tail back and forth, and also began to hiss. Not wishing to show her fear, Kashtanka began to bark loudly and rushed toward the cat. "Hey, hey, hey, what's going on?" The stranger's voice thundered. "What's the meaning of this? Get to your places." He walked over to the cat. Oh, that's Rizzo, who's also listening to the story, but he sees somebody to bark at, so you'll have to forgive him. We can pretend it's Kashtanka barking. He walked over to the cat. "Fyodor Timofeyich, lie down." Turning to the goose, he continued, "Ivan Ivanich, back to your spot." With that, the master began to pet Kashtanka. "You must live peacefully," he said. "They're good company, they won't hurt you. But what are we going to call you? You've got to have a name." The stranger thought it over for a moment and said, "We'll call you Auntie." And after repeating the word Auntie several times, he left the room. There's the stranger peering around his bedroom door, wondering what all the fuss is about. And here's Kashtanka barking at the goose and the white cat. A bit later, the stranger returned, bringing with him a strange contraption with a bell, a pistol, and several strings attached. He set the contraption down and said, "Ivan Ivanich, if you would be so kind." The goose walked up to him, stopped, and waited in an expectant pose. Then, when the stranger shouted, "Help! Fire! Fire!" Ivan Ivanich rushed toward the gate, took a string in his beak, pulled the string, and rang the bell. The stranger was very pleased. Hey, here's a strange contraption. A bell, a pistol, some strings. The goose pulls the strings and rings the bell. And Kashtanka thinks that this is very cool. For an hour, the stranger made the goose circle him, jump through a hoop, and flap his feet in the air. When the goose was exhausted, the stranger shouted, "Marya, bring in Kavrona Ivanova." A minute later, an old woman appeared and let in a sow. The master called out, "Fyodor Timofeyich, if you would be so kind." The cat got up and reluctantly, as if he were doing someone a great favor, walked over to the sow. "Now then, let's start with the Egyptian pyramid," the master began. "A 1, 2, 3. On the word 3, Ivan Ivanich jumped up onto the pig's back. When the goose had gained his footing, Fyodor Timofeyich climbed onto the sow's back and then clambered onto the goose and stood up on his hind legs. Kashtanka yelped with delight, but at that very moment the cat yawned, lost his balance, and fell off the goose. Hey, see that? That's the goose doing all his tricks. laying dead, kicking his feet in the air, jumping through the hoop. And here's the famous Egyptian pyramid. The cat on the goose, and the goose on the pig. A month passed. The training and dinners made the days interesting for Auntie, but evenings were rather boring. Most evenings the master went somewhere and took the goose and cat with him. Left on her own, Auntie would start to feel sad. Two shadowy figures with pleasant deer faces would appear in her imagination. As she fell asleep, Auntie had the feeling that they smelled of glue, wood shavings, and varnish. One day, before the training session, the master said, "It's time we got down to business, Auntie. You've been lolling around long enough. I'm going to make a performer out of you." For the first lesson, Auntie learned how to stand and walk on her hind legs, which pleased her no end. In the following lessons, she danced, ran on a lead, howled to music, rang the bell, shot the pistol, and in a month's time, she could capably substitute for Fyodor Timofeyevich in the Egyptian pyramid. The teacher was delighted. "Talent," he would say. "Real talent." Okay, there's Kashtanka being a performer. She's got a little kerchief tied around her head and is dancing on her hind legs while the goose and the cat watch. Talent. One night, Auntie was having a dream in which she was being chased by the cleaning man with a broom, and she woke up frightened. It was quiet, dark, and very stuffy in the room. The master heaved a heavy sigh in the next room. A little bit later, the sow grunted in the shed, and then all was quiet again. Auntie closed her eyes so that she would fall asleep more quickly, since she knew from experience that the sooner you fall asleep, the sooner morning comes. But suddenly she heard a strange cry. It was Ivan Ivanitch. His cry sounded wild, piercing, and unnatural. Unable to make anything out in the darkness and not understanding what was happening, Auntie let out a growl. In a moment, the master entered the room holding a candle. The flickering light chased the darkness away. Ivan Ivanitch was lying on the floor and wasn't sleeping. His wings were outspread, and he looked as if he were completely exhausted and wanted a drink of water. "Ivan Ivanitch, what's the matter with you?" the master asked the goose. "Are you sick?" The goose remained silent. The master petted him and left the room, taking the light with him. Two dim green sparks flashed next to Auntie. It was Fyodor Timofeyevich, who for the first time since they'd known each other had come over. Auntie licked his paw and, without even asking why he'd come, began to whimper. Ivan Ivanitch honked again. The door opened once more, and the master entered, holding a candle and a saucer of water. The goose was lying in the same position as before, with his wings outspread. His eyes were closed. Excuse me for a moment. "Hey, sit down. Stop barking." Thank you. To continue. "Drink, Ivan Ivanitch," the master said tenderly as he put the saucer down in front of the goose. "Take a sip of water, my darling." But Ivan Ivanitch didn't move. He didn't move, and he didn't open his eyes. "There's nothing we can do now," the master sighed after a moment. "It's all over. Poor Ivan Ivanitch. How shall I manage without you?" One evening the master said, "Today, Auntie, you will substitute for the late Ivan Ivanitch in the Egyptian pyramid." With that, he picked up Auntie and Fyodor Timofeyevich, tucked them under his fur coat, and left the room. After some time, Auntie poked her head out, but seeing an enormous room full of monsters, she immediately drew back. This is what she saw. A big elephant, a horse, a fierce tiger. Ooh, that's enough to scare anybody. A moment later, the master flung open his coat. They were now in a little room with gray walls. The master put on a wig, smeared his face with something white, and dressed himself in an outlandish costume, the likes of which Auntie had never seen. Just then a man in a white waistcoat looked into the room and said, "You're on next." The master kissed Auntie on the head and put her in a suitcase with Fyodor Timofeyevich. There's the master dressed up in his... That's right, he's a clown, dressed up in his clown suit. A moment later, Auntie felt the suitcase hit something hard and it stopped rocking. "Ladies and gentlemen," she heard the master shout, "there's something very heavy in this suitcase. It must be gold. Let's open it and see." The lock to the suitcase clicked. Auntie jumped out, and, deafened by the roar, ran circles around her master and broke into a shrill bark. "Uncle Fyodor Timofeyevich, dearest Auntie," the master shouted, "beloved relatives, how did you get in there?" He grabbed the cat and Auntie and embraced them. While he hugged her, Auntie glanced at the world into which fate had thrown her. This new world was large and full of light. Wherever you looked on all sides, from floor to ceiling, all you could see were faces. "Auntie, please take your seat," the master shouted. "First you and I will sing a song, and then we'll dance, all right?" He took a little pipe out of his pocket and started to play. "Daddy," a child's voice shouted just then, "that's Kashtanka." There's the master playing his pipe while Auntie sings, and Fyodor Timofeyevich is watching. Suddenly they hear a voice. Oh, it's Fedushka. Recognizes Kashtanka. "Kashtanka it is," affirmed a tenor voice. "May God strike me dead if that isn't Kashtanka." Somebody in the balcony whistled, and two voices, one a child and the other a man's, called loudly, "Kashtanka! Kashtanka, come here, girl!" Auntie shuddered and looked in the direction of the shouts. Two faces, one with a big beard, the other chubby and rosy-cheeked, looking in her directions, and suddenly it struck her in a flash. She remembered. She fell off the chair onto the sand, and then jumped up, and with a joyful yap, dashed toward those two faces. "Hey, that's enough. No more. No barking." There was a deafening roar, pierced by whistles, and the sound of a child shouting, "Kashtanka! Kashtanka!" Auntie jumped over the barrier, and then over somebody's shoulder, and found herself in the first ring. In order to get to the next tier, she had to leap over a high wall. Auntie jumped, but not high enough, and she slipped back down the wall. Then she was passed from person to person, licking hands and faces along the way, until at last she reached the top balcony. There's Kashtanka climbing out of the circus ring up into the balcony. Half an hour later, Kashtanka was walking down the street behind two people who smelled of glue and varnish. Fedyushka walked alongside his father, Luka Alexandrovich, wearing the cabinet maker's cap. Kashtanka was looking at them both from behind. It seemed to her that she had been following them for a long time, and she was happy that her life with them had not been interrupted for a single second. She remembered the little room with the dirty wallpaper, the goose Ivan Ivanitch, Fyodor Timofeyevich, the tasty dinners, the lessons, and the circus. But now, all that seemed no more than a long and confused dream. Here they are, heading home. And that's the end. I hope you enjoyed it. Kashtanka by Anton Chekov. Illustrations by Genady Spirin. Pretty good story, huh? My audience loved it, as you can tell. Would you like to see my audience? Let me go get my audience here. Come here, audience. Yeah, come on up. Say hi to the kids. Come on. Ooh, what I found. That's Rizzo the dog over in the peanut gallery over there by the tree, barking at everybody that he could see. That's his job. I pay him. Luckily he works cheap. He works for kibble. Which is good. Want to say hi? He's looking for you. Okay, that's enough for today.